Hi everyone, I'm Haff, Cloud Evangelist with Red Hat, and today I'm going to share with you a presentation, Open Hybrid Clouds, that I gave a version of at the Red Hat Forum in Asia in October 2013. So let's get started. So you all scale like Google, you want to manage data like Facebook, and you want to have the agility of Amazon.com and Amazon Web Services. Or maybe you're thinking, well, no, because those big internet giants are really unique. They're nothing like my enterprise or my organization. One of the things I hope to convince you of today is that while those companies certainly are unique and certainly are not typical, they also in many ways shine a spotlight on where IT is going, and therefore where the IT in your organization will be going. So let's first talk about scale. However you define computing scale in your own organization is probably increasing. And this isn't just about the number of servers. It's about the explosion of mobile, which is one of the quote-unquote third platform technologies that market researchers IDC talk about. IT is also getting more and more central to businesses of more and more firms. It touches more customers, more processes, and more data. And this isn't just in the traditional IT-centric industries like financial services. We also see the role of IT increasing in mining, in agriculture, in heavy manufacturing, indeed, just about everywhere. Now we move on to talk about managing data. Here's a quote from McKinsey & Company, the management consultants, a couple years ago, saying the use of big data will become a key basis of competition and growth for individual firms, and that all companies, therefore, need to take big data seriously. I could argue that we've maybe done ourselves a bit of a disservice as an industry with this big data term, because it tends to focus the attention on the volume of data, or maybe the real-timeness of data, or the variety of data. And while that's certainly a trend, I'd argue that perhaps the bigger trend is just the pervasive use of data in many forms. MIT's Andrew McAfee told an interesting anecdote at the MIT Sloan CIO Symposium earlier this year when he talked about how the publishing industry was increasingly moving from a culture of lunches, which is to say that people got together over lunch and discussed their hunches about what books were going to sell well and which weren't. And instead it's being replaced by a culture where there's more systematic use of data. And of course, that's driven by Amazon.com and the other internet businesses. The third characteristic is agility, flexibility, and this takes a number of different forms. What I've shown here is really the developer-centric view of that, where a developer wants to be able to very quickly code and deploy and have their users and have their businesses reap the benefits of that code. And I'm going to talk a bit more detail about that in a few minutes. But the basic idea here is that the resources devoted to a given application need to very rapidly scale up and down. The applications themselves need to be developed more quickly, given that they're both more ephemeral and they're also being more directly connected to revenue than ever before. So agility, flexibility, the ability to spin up and down resources for promotions or whatever the business needs are really becoming more important than ever. And what that all comes together to say is that the old way doesn't get you there any longer. There's business demand for these different innovations. There's business demands for these new ways of doing business. And traditional IT infrastructure doesn't get you there. And what you're left with is what you can call an IT services gap or an IT innovation gap. It doesn't really matter that much what you call it. But the bottom line is you can't just keep doing things in your traditional way and hope to meet up with these new business demands for innovation. The way the public cloud providers or the internet giants that we've talked about have done it is with open source, open standards, and with the open innovation model that's made possible by and is driven by open source. If you look at the big public clouds, they're all running Linux. They're all making extensive use of other types of open source software to greater or lesser degrees. They're making contributions back into a variety of open source projects that touch on areas that are of particular interest to them. But even if we look at what's running on those public clouds, at Amazon Web Services, for example, there's far more Linux than there is Windows. And I think this just really reflects that the open source way is where a lot of the new innovation is happening out there. It's not happening in the proprietary software world as much as it's happening in the open source world. Let's talk OpenStack as an example of how this open innovation is happening. There's a huge number of companies contributing to it. And in fact, I'd argue that one of the main reasons why OpenStack is such an interesting project isn't because of some specific interesting technologies within OpenStack today, although those are certainly there, but rather because such a community of developers and partners and others have gathered around OpenStack. And it's really that mass of participation that's made OpenStack so interesting. But it's not just about what's happening at the internet giants or with Web 2.0 companies. This is some research that IDC conducted last year of a range of organizations about what their feelings about having an open cloud were, open cloud technologies. And 72% said it was either an absolute requirement or at the very least a key factor. This importance of openness in clouds is not unique to just one space. It really spreads across the entire industry. I'm also going to argue that transformed IT requires a hybrid approach. Now, by hybrid here, I don't mean the narrow cloud bursting, move workloads from public clouds to private clouds minute to minute, as I think was sometimes talked about when that term was first introduced in this space. Rather, I mean hybrid as this combination of different technology platforms, some of which are on-premise, some of which are in various types of public cloud providers. And you basically have a choice of which of those different technology platforms and which of those different types of ownership and payment models you want to choose on an individual project basis. And then IT really manages this entire portfolio that is happening in different places. So let's bring this all together. IT is becoming more strategic because they have to deliver these services and capabilities that the business needs. They're hybrid, so they're going to be managing services that are being deployed in many different places. And they're achieving that with open source, open standards-based technologies. Now, I've been using IT as a single term. Now I'm going to spend a few minutes breaking that apart a little bit and talk about developers, IT operations, and the business. These different constituencies are, in fact, working more closely together, I'd argue, than they have historically. But I think it's still useful to look at the kind of different requirements and mandates for each of those parts of the overall business. So let's first of all talk about the developer. The developer's role has arguably changed more than anyone's in recent years. My former analyst colleague, Stephen O'Grady, came out with a book last year called The New Kingmakers, where he made the argument that developers were increasingly driving decision-making within IT organizations. I think this argument can be overstated, but nonetheless, I think it's an important dynamic as we move forward and as new applications and new services are important to more and more different types of businesses. So what does the developer care about? Well, the developer has all these applications to write, so the developer wants to be productive. And part of being productive is having access to the tools that they need to do their jobs. These include getting access to the new innovations that are happening in open source. There's very little in the way of language development these days that isn't open source. So they need access to all that. They also want access to all of their familiar tools as well. They also want to be able to focus on the details that matter. A lot of the mechanics of getting a server and setting it up and deploying it are plumbing that a developer needs to have done so that they can develop applications, but it's not actually something that developers care about. And they also need ways to integrate this new application development they're doing with existing software and processes within their business. So how do we do this? Platform as a service is one important ingredient here. Here's a quote from Gartner. The use of platforms as service technologies will enable IT organizations to become more agile and more responsive to the business needs. If we look at this slide, which sort of breaks down the tasks needed to write and deploy an application, or at least some of them, the point here is that there's a lot fewer of those steps with a PaaS than there is with a physical server. And in fact, even a virtualized server doesn't necessarily help all that much. So PaaS is really getting the infrastructure out of the way of the developer. In terms of integrating with existing applications and processes, this is an interesting announcement that Red Hat made back in October, JBoss XPaaS for Openshift. What you see here is you've got the Openshift Platform as a Service on the bottom here. You have the JEE application server on top there. So lots of people today are using Openshift to develop Java applications. And then on top here, and this is kind of the new piece, the integration PaaS, the BPM PaaS, and the mobile PaaS. What this is up here is using various elements of the JBoss middleware portfolio, such as messaging and business rules and so forth, and bringing them essentially into the PaaS environment. And what this does is it really enables applications developed with Openshift. They'll be able to better integrate with existing business processes, with existing enterprise applications, and so forth, because we really view Platform as a Service as not something that's just about developing certain styles of new applications, but something that really can be used as a fundamental part of enterprise application development. If we shift our focus to IT operations now, what are they trying to do? Well, I could actually summarize, I think, almost everything that's on the right-hand side of this slide with one word, and that would be automation. And if I had two words, I'd probably use something like relentless automation. Because as we talk about moving to cloud environments, that's really one of the very key pieces here. The need to delegate out for self-service end users, but then automate that provisioning. Automate things like scaling, automate things like security remediations and so forth. Ultimately, this is all about creating standardization, because standardization not only reduces the amount of work that's needed to keep these environments up and running, but it also creates a much more consistent experience, and an experience that can be much more federated and kept under a centralized policy control. There's another interesting aspect with how infrastructures are evolving for the cloud, however, and that's that they're evolving to take into account what are largely new styles of workloads. If you look at the existing, sometimes called systems of record workloads, you have these individual instances which are carefully maintained. Some of them may conflict with each other. You have to sort of keep them apart in that respect. There's typically a complex setup. And sort of once you have the thing up and running, you don't want to breathe on it too much, if you would. You tend to keep these production workloads around for a long time. Whereas if you look at cloud-style workloads, they're much smaller, they're much more modular, they tend to be replicated a lot. That's kind of where that automation comes in. And they're just overall much lighter weight. Bill Baker, who used to be at Microsoft, sometimes refers to these as pets. So if a pet gets sick, you nurse it back to health and so forth. And cattle, where if the cow gets sick, well, you get a new cow. And that's sort of the different model of these two workloads, the stateful and the stateless. We even announced that at Red Hat, particular product offering that explicitly recognizes these two different styles of workloads, as well as the hybrid workloads that combine the two. So you sort of have your traditional enterprise virtualization for the traditional enterprise workloads. In fact, you may even run those in physical servers in some cases. So you've got Red Hat Enterprise Virtualization there. Your new style workloads are a great match for Red Hat Enterprise Linux OpenStack platform, the cloud style workloads. And then with Red Hat Cloud Forms, where you have a cloud management platform, that provides you that common policy and that single pane of glass management on top of both those styles. Finally, you have the business imperative. Business basically cares about delivery of revenue producing services. And the business is also, in many cases, interested in keeping some abstraction between underlying infrastructure and the application development on top of that. This matters in a number of different environments, but it's perhaps most obvious in certain types of government procurement situations, because often agencies want to run their own infrastructure and contract out to do application development, for example. And there are some real benefits from a procurement standpoint in keeping those two layers separate from each other. And ultimately, what we're moving towards here is having a set of services that the business users can consume wherever and whenever they need to. This is another analyst quote, this time from Forrester. Management in the future of cloud shifts to providing, measuring, and using portfolios of services. Focus on building enterprise libraries of reusable application images and workloads for public clouds and hybrid consumption. This really is a fundamentally new way of doing things, and it's really perhaps one of the most radical changes that we've seen in how IT operates within an organization. Much of this is being driven by open source again. I talked about open source in the context of public clouds earlier, but if you look at, say, Red Hat's portfolio here, all of our products are open source. They're all driven by open source innovation, whether we're talking hybrid cloud management, cloud forms, platforms as a service with Openshift, infrastructure as a service with OpenStack, distributed storage with Red Hat Storage Server, enterprise virtualization with Red Hat Enterprise Virtualization, middleware, and of course, Red Hat Enterprise Linux, which really forms the foundation for so much of this. And that's Red Hat Open Hybrid Cloud. It's a rich portfolio of upstream communities as well as commercial products. It all ties in with each other, so that I know it's a cliche, but the whole is really greater than the sum of the parts with Red Hat's cloud portfolio. There's lots there to get you started today. There's lots of information up on redhat.com. Here's my info. Thanks for watching or listening.